Onden Wakun circle at the campsite. We planned the camping trip as a breath away from the city. Backpacks, a fire, and the kind of silence that promised to heal. I, Lucas, Jake, and another friend followed narrow trails to a clearing where a stream sang softly. We pitched the tents, ate, told stories, and left the world behind. At night, when the flames were only embers, Lucas went down to the stream and came back different. There were footprints around the campsite, enormous, fresh, circular, as if something had walked around us while we slept. We tried to explain them away as animals, a prank by another group, but those marks didn't match anything human. The rest of the vigil was tense. Every crack sounded like a warning. When dawn came, we packed in silence, and before leaving, a heavy noise from the woods made us run. We didn't see anything beyond the motionless trees, only the trail of steps we never had the courage to follow. We left the place swallowed by an unease that never left us. Since then, I avoid returning to that point on the map. We stayed on the road until the sun touched the treetops, yet the image of the prince didn't fade. It returned to me even in daylight. I walked around the clearing looking for clues. Claw marks, tracks, anything that might give sense to that perfect circumference. I found nothing beyond what we already knew, an indecipherable heavy outline. Lucas, always practical, suggested we mark the perimeter with stones. I hesitated but accepted the idea as if a simple ritual could contain the inexplicable. At dusk, while we were packing, there was a new mark by the stream, as if the thing had walked closer and then moved away just to remind us of its presence. In the city, I searched for rational explanations. Wild boar tracks, someone playing a prank, a herd passing through. But the paint of logic began to crack when we told the story, and none of us could reproduce the weight we had felt pressing on our shoulders. At night I had white dreams, not nightmares of monsters, only the memory of the prince turning, always turning, as if they were cradling something motionless at the center. I thought distance and the city noise would dilute the discomfort over time. They did not. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the sensation of going in circles, as if the world had acquired a new invisible axis that held me. Months later, walking through a park, I felt the same chill in passing. There were no secret trails, no murmuring stream, just children and dogs, and yet the same shiver ran down my spine. I realized the forest had left me something, a permanent suspicion that not every empty space is truly unoccupied. When we discussed the episode among ourselves, we avoided details. We were hands that did not want to touch the dark stain of a recent past. Still, on nights of weak wind, I still hear an imagined sound of long steps circling my house, and I pause for a moment to respect the silence I now understand as vigilance. Returning to that campsite is no longer an option for me. The trail remains on the map, but for me it is crossed out in charcoal. Lucas tried to go back once with another group, as if confrontation could dissolve the fear. They found only the stream and smooth stones. The marks had vanished. Nothing moved to greet them, and yet Lucas's face, when he called me, carried a forced calm, the kind that hides something no one wants to admit. The four of us learned not to speak too loudly about that night, as if naming what we saw might call back what watched us. Now, when I hike, I'm not the same as I was before. I walk with keener eyes, with the feeling that simple contours may be disguising something larger. Nature is not a villain, but it keeps secrets that do not obey human curiosity. Learning that was a hard lesson for me, and if one day you camp there, you might notice the stream's sound shortening its beat, a rhythm that is not human, and that in its stillness seems to mark the fact that we left alive. In silence, I'm grateful for that. 2. Steps on the ceiling. The apartment was too cheap to be pleasant, creaking floors, protesting pipes. I'd lived there only a short time and at first noticed only subtle noises, But one night the footsteps began, a rhythmic banging above my room, heavy, too human to be the building settling. The noise came and stopped in patterns, then a thump, as if something massive had fallen. Damp stains, and finally a crack in the ceiling that hadn't been there before. I called the landlord. He swore there was nothing in the attic. At night the sound returned, even closer, a soft hammering, and then indistinct voices in the wall. I locked up, grabbed my things and left at dawn without looking back. Today, when I close the door of a new place, I carry the feeling that something was beating from inside the very ceiling. After fleeing, I moved into another apartment, and the paranoid sense of being watched came with me for a time. It was like carrying an old object in my pocket, always present, too heavy. Over time, I tried to turn the fear into precautions. I inspected the ceiling, called a technician to check the structure, reviewed the beams. Everything came back clean on the report, nothing above, nothing visible. And that lack of explanation solidified the fear into a dark corner of the mind. Sometimes, when the house is in absolute silence, I still imagine a paused step overhead, a cadence that doesn't belong to any living creature. The nights that followed were long. I became my own home sentinel. I checked the ceiling as if it were a friend that owed me an answer. When my breathing settled and nothing came, I permitted myself the laziness of lowering the curtains and losing myself in a book. But the calm was fragile. The smallest creak made me hold my breath, and as a precaution, I kept a half-packed bag by the door. I learned to sleep with a light on, a torch that flickered between reason and superstition. The footsteps, when they returned in other people's lives, came with subtlety, like a crossed conversation through a wall. Sometimes I felt only the echo. Other times, noises so defined I could imagine a soul preceding a fall. I was certain that if it were a human, they would have chosen a less elaborate alibi. And if it wasn't human, then it made no sense to bang on tiles, since it could traverse my sleep without effort. That doubt ate at any attempt at normalcy. I told friends, related the story in fragments, gauging reactions. Some laughed and said, "Old building, it's normal." Others fell silent, as if their own truth also had stories buried in the floorboards. The most disturbing reply came from someone who whispered, "There are places that answer our fear." Since then, I avoid absolute silence. The radio on low, the washing machine running downstairs, any noise that proves the world is not frozen. Still, when I put my hand on the door of the hotel that now shelters me, I feel that familiar chill. There's a strange comfort in constant movement, not to avoid something, but to let the world show it's vast and full of other things. Sometimes, however, when the night falls and everything seems suspended, I hear a slight beat of that old tapping in the ceiling and close my eyes, accepting that some noises have no explanation and that, for now, I have learned to live with them. 3. The man on the trail. I was walking alone along an infrequently used shortcut, the kind of path that bends suddenly and disappears into shadow. The forest was quiet, light sparse beneath an ancient canopy. I saw a silhouette in the distance, motionless, in the middle of the path like a statue. At first I thought it was another hiker, but when I approached it made no sound or sign. I waved. There was no response. It only mirrored me, one step when I took a step, one step when I stepped back. Fear rose slowly, and then accelerated. I started running. It ran. I lost my bearings. The trail curved in a way I didn't recognize, and only when I reached the main road did I look back and see it vanish among the trees, as if it had never existed. I returned days later in daylight, and the turn where I had seen it simply wasn't there. It was like the forest had erased the path to something that didn't want to be found again. In the car, with the distance of the woods between us, I tried to rationalize. A lost person, an isolated prank, a shadow made of thought. but the way the figure imitated us remained carved into my memory. It wasn't casual mimicry, it was calculation, and that chilled the skin. There were days of looking over my shoulder, of avoiding roots that cut through the wood. Half of me wanted to forget, the other half knew that forgetting was a weakness the forest could exploit. I went back in daylight, trying to confront the memory. I found no trace of that corridor-like path, only trees and stones, and a silence that returned nothing. There was, however, a fine sensation, like an empty room holding the last vibrations of old voices. I left without hurry, with the feeling that something there still watched me, perhaps patient, waiting until I had forgotten enough to come back. I turned the story into a road anecdote with friends to soften it. But on windless nights, when I pass long alleys, the shiver returns. The mind tries to fill in what it didn't understand. Maybe it's the projection of a loneliness so dense it takes on shape. Maybe it's a man who learned to move between the world's contours like a mark that comes back to meet whoever noticed it. I don't know. I only know that the image of that silhouette, motionless and persistent, refuses to be ordinary. Over time, I realized the phenomenon did not require eyes to exist. It was enough that someone, anyone, felt that the path was no longer safe, and the figure would appear as if reflecting their own insecurity. I learned not to ignore the discomfort that rises in the stomach when entering an empty trail. It is often the best map we have. Today I veer off, choose the wide road, leave the wood to those who need absolute silence. Still, on rare occasions, I take the route back in the afternoon and wait to see the shadow, just to convince myself it wasn't invented. I never find it. And perhaps that is the worst part. The figure remains a promise, not of presence, but of possible return. And that reminds me there are things that don't disappear. They only hide long enough for us to risk going after them again. 4. The shortcut that didn't exist. I discovered a narrow path that diverged from the main trail, an invitation hidden among grass and trunks. I entered out of curiosity and soon noticed the air had changed, colder, a stillness that swallowed sound. The path curved endlessly, and with every turn, everything looked the same. When I tried to retrace my steps, the track had vanished. No longer a path, just leaves and branches, as if there had never been a trail there. At the heart of that geometric deception, I found an old cabin. Inside, a scribbled map marked trails in red ink, including the route I shouldn't have taken. The door banged behind me. Silence became a presence. I ran out confused, and since then, I've avoided hidden shortcuts. Not every road that finds you wants you to return. The cabin I found was a monument to forgetting. The map on the table felt more like a warning than curiosity. The red-marked trails had the air of a ritual script, not routes, but boundaries of territory not to be explored. I left with the map in hand and a sense that it should be kept secret, perhaps forever. For nights afterward, I dreamed of red lines moving on their own, drawing circles on the ground around my house. Having that map in my possession made me understand that some places recompose themselves only under other people's eyes, as if they kept their own caprices. When I told someone, the reaction was a mix of fascination and disbelief. No one wanted to check the spot I pointed to, as if they feared that by looking, the territory would reclaim what belonged to it. A month later, I received an anonymous letter, an aged sheet with a fragment drawn, a piece of the cabin's map. The handwriting was almost unreadable, something like a warning. Not everything that takes you back allows returns. I threw the paper into the fire. Still, the night when the cabin door had slammed and the silence closed in returned to visit me in unexpected noises. A door creaking with no wind, footsteps passing outside and then moving away. I came to learn that the nature of these gaps on maps is less a geographic error and more a mark of will. Some paths prefer to disappear when watched by eyes that belong to those who live nearby. They remain for those who know them, and for the curious, they reconstitute themselves in deceptive forms. That lesson made me less curious and more careful. There are beauties, curiosity strips from the world, like someone plucking petals from a flower until it is no more. Still, I would sometimes return to the wood with caution, not to find the lost way, but to recognize the craft of concealment the land practices. I learned to leave subtle signs, a turned stone, a notch on a branch, hoping that if something wanted to follow me, I would make it follow my trace instead of losing my own. It is a foolish maneuver, perhaps, but it helps keep the feeling that even if the earth lies, I can at least learn some of its rules. 5. The cabin in the mist. We booked an isolated cabin among old trees, expecting wood, wine, and a weekend without signal. In the morning, a dense fog swallowed the world. It seemed liquid, dragging sound with it. We went out to see the lake, but the trail spiraled on itself. Each curve brought us back to the same point. Time lost meaning. A tapping noise began distant. A tap, 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 that approached like an insistent metronome. We ran only to find another decrepit cabin, different from ours, its door wide open. We entered on instinct and found candles and marks that were not ours. Everything exhaled an ancient waiting. When we finally returned to our cabin, we shut the windows and left that night, carrying the sense that something in the mist preferred we not come back. The fog in that region felt like a breathing body, slowly swallowing the landscape and holding sounds like secrets. We walked carefully, but the sensation of repetition turned into panic when we realized the trail circled us like a clock with rigid hands. The tap, tap that followed us ceased to be a noise and became a character, rhythmic, patient, full of cadence. Going into the cabin, we found, wasn't an act of courage. It was an impulse, almost automatic, as if something in us wanted to confront the experience. Inside, the candles and the old map seemed to stage a theater of waiting. And in the center, one detail, a piece of fabric, similar to what someone might have worn the last time they left that place. I lifted it. There were specks of dry earth on it, as if left by footsteps carrying a secret. When we returned to our cabin, the silence had deepened. The world reflected what we'd seen, a feeling that something had followed us, not to attack, but to acknowledge us as witnesses. We packed in silence, the weak fire mirroring tired eyes. In the car, someone finally exhaled and said, "Don't make noise." It was a command to ourselves, to avoid calling back whatever moved in the mist. Over time, I learned that the mist has memory. It nests lost things and returns them to the first person who steps where they shouldn't. On foggy nights, I prefer not to cross valleys I've seen before. I let the mist keep its secrets. Still, there is a subtle attraction, a curiosity that hurts when controlled and calls again whenever the night promises silence. Sometimes, when I'm alone and feel the air shift, I think of that tap, tap, and realize there was a lesson in that escape. Strength doesn't save us as much as humility does. Letting go, gathering our steps, and accepting that certain places have calls that cannot and should not be answered. I carry that with me, a hesitant comfort, a repellent to the urge to return. 6. The tap on the train wall. The night train felt calm. Few passengers, the repeated sway of the tracks, a kind of anesthetic that makes long hours bearable. At midnight, a sound began, 3 knocks in a row against the wall, then a pause, and again, always in threes. At first, I chalked it up to the train, to loose metal, but the sound came from the wall next to my seat, from an empty space where there was no one. I went out into the corridor, absolute silence. When I moved forward through the cars, the lights flickered and a voice whispered very close, "Why are you here?" Reflexively, I ran back to my seat, my heart hammering, and stayed, awake until the end of the trip, feeling as if something had crossed the metal and lived there on the other side, accompanying me. The train left me at the station with a tired body and ears ringing from those 3 repeated knocks. The city seemed normal in contrast, but a thread of tension followed me. The next day, telling the story at work, I noticed people avoiding the final note. No one knew what to say about a voice that asks, "Why are you here?" through steel. Some colleagues laughed, others sighed. Days later, I took another night train to confront the fear. The sound did not return, but the anticipation made me notice small details. The way the lights shaped faces into shadows, how the seat behind retained old odors. I remained alert to the walls, as if they might have eyes, as if the metal in mute could whisper secrets when pressed. Nothing happened, and that was in a way worse. The absence of an event confirmed that the train itself could be a place that takes what disturbs it. In the calm of those trips replaced by taxis, I found myself changing seats as if avoiding a cursed spot. Paranoia draws its own map. Not always rational, but effective. I learned not to ignore the small signals. That sound did not ask for help. It asked a question. Questions are trampolines, and I am not inclined to jump into depths without knowing what awaits. But there was more. I realized that when I travel, my body records space like an animal records scents, a sequence of impressions that line up with danger. Train travel became an exercise in presence. Be alert enough to notice the inconsistent, distant enough not to invite it under my skin. That delicate balance changed how I move at night. Even now, when I hear a metallic sound or 3 knocks in an irrational pattern, my body reacts as if on the rails. It's not courage that now guides me, but prudence. I learned to accept that some night journeys carry questions that do not belong to us to answer. At least, not without paying a price. 7. The street without lamps. One night, a detour took me down an unfamiliar street, narrow without lampposts, flanked by tall houses with blind windows. A sound began, a rhythmic beating, distant at first, then closer, seeming to double my pace. Looking back, there was no one. The street folded and curled, so my sense of direction failed. The figure I noticed ahead was tall, motionless, merely an elongated shadow between the houses. I ran to the light of a main avenue, and when I stepped onto the illuminated sidewalk, the sound stopped. Turning to look, the street behind me seemed to disappear into the dark as if it had never existed. Since then, I avoid nighttime shortcuts. There are paths that do not want to be walked. That lampless street seemed stitched around older shadows than the houses themselves. After the night I ran through it, I can no longer walk alleyways at night without imagining the buildings spying. The feeling of being watched by dark windows left a mental tattoo. Never be sure if the street you chose really exists. I returned in daylight with a friend to prove my sanity. The street had the same row of pale houses, the same crooked sidewalks, but none of the strange features. No sound, no stretched figure. That didn't calm me. It only showed that the experience depends on an hour, a temperature, an alignment that escapes reason. Sometimes, harmless places keep windows that open only when someone crosses on the wrong night. Over time, I realized the street taught me the difference between darkness and absence. The first has weight and texture, the second is merely lack of light. That rhythmic tapping that seemed to keep pace with me testified that the city can replicate the breathing of those who walk it and sometimes mark steps so others will follow. I learned not to be the first to cross a road that folds without sense. On work nights, I took longer routes to avoid the street that should not exist, and, along the way, I noticed how much of the world we see when we slow down. Details that used to escape me clarified that fear had made me more attentive, not less. That clarity gave me a bitter calm. I prefer to see the environment, even with anxiety, alive, than to slink between shadows that dictate the logic. Now I laugh softly when someone dramatizes nocturnal scenarios for effect. I know fear is a faulty guide, but sometimes a merciful one. I avoid the street without lamps, and when I pass similar alleys, I quicken my pace and don't look back. There are things in cities that show up only when left alone. Perhaps that's why I learned to preserve the anonymity of silent dread. 8. The headlights behind. On a deserted road, 2 points of light appeared in my rear view and insisted on keeping the same distance for miles. I accelerated. They accelerated. I braked. They kept their mark behind the car, as if dancing in my wake. Suddenly, they vanished, as if they had never existed. A fleeting relief. Then they reappeared, so close I felt the heat of the lamps. A panic without clear reason made me flee to a lit gas station. When I looked back, the road was empty again. I never knew if someone was truly chasing me or if the road was showing me another face. All I knew was I didn't drive that way at night again. That pursuit of lights left a mark on the way I drive. I never again trusted a pair of headlights in the mirror. Now, on empty roads, I hold my breath when headlights approach slowly, as if the darkness were deciding whether I should be followed. The road proved able to toy with my mind, so I began planning alternate routes, gas stations, and even safe hours. After the incident, I shared the experience in forums and heard similar stories. Headlights that maintain perfect balance, disappear and reappear, dance in a cadence that defies physics. Some people widened their eyes, theories of bad luck, of macabre pursuit. Others laughed, citing nocturnal mischief. But there were few plausible explanations, and that was what really disturbed me. The apparitions weren't just technical anomalies. They seemed deliberate manifestations of something wanting to be noticed. When I stopped at a station, trying to steady my pulse, an old man saw my state and without ceremony said, "Roads keep echoes of things that passed them." It wasn't superstition, just a simple word for the inexplicable. After that, when the highway seemed to end in emptiness, I made sure to keep conversation on the radio, call someone, any noise to indicate human activity, to avoid feeling like the target of a lamp show. The episode left me not only cautious, but also with acceptance that some experiences are unexplainable, only manageable. Preparation turned into action, keeping documents updated, memorizing alternate routes, making a list of 24-hour stations. I learned that the sense of being followed rarely depends on a real vehicle. The road reflects fear more than the car does. In the end, I drove slower on empty nights, watching the play of lights while keeping my hands steady on the wheel. Once in the distance, I saw those same cadence headlights again. And instead of speeding away, I slowed, breathed, and let them pass. As if choosing not to react is sometimes the best way not to feed whatever insists on following. 9. The House of Footsteps. I went to look after a relative's Victorian house. At dusk, the vast silence put me on edge. Worn, steps, old furniture, an air of stories that did not want to be opened. At night, I heard long, measured footsteps on the upper floor, a level I had checked alone. I went up with a flashlight. The corridor was empty. I decided to leave, but as my keys touched the door, a thin voice floated down from upstairs, calling something back as if naming it. Come back. I left without looking, and never returned. The house continued to breathe on its own, as if it kept memories it preferred to keep, locked. The distance I left between myself and that Victorian house grew over time, as if the farther I went, the less power what lived there had. I tried to convince myself that old books, drafts, and Twilight's imagination explained everything. Yet the voice I heard, a single syllable, the gentle call to come back, made the most rational part of me give way to fear. When I told my cousin I tried to soften the tale, she smiled with a pity that mixed scorn and understanding. For her, the walls of that house carried a heavy memory of generations. For me, memory had become a presence that took on the voice of those who had not quite left. After that, I decided that houses that old should remain unvisited, like reliquaries, admirable, but not for living in. I heard by word of mouth of similar cases, temporary residents who felt names whispered from the floorboards or heard footsteps in the hall with no visitor present. That made me think the house had no malicious purpose. It had its own cycle, a succession of invitations and rejections that didn't include recent tenants. Understanding that brought no comfort, but it explained the cold urgency with which the wood seemed to call. Years taught me to listen less. When something in a house begins to demand attention insistently, it's likely the place is merely claiming company it won't receive back in affection. When I pass by the property now, I feel the habitual shiver and cross the street without looking. The voice may still be there perhaps, but I learned that not every call is meant to be answered. Today, when I sleep, I bolt the doors quickly and avoid spaces with long corridors and high ceilings. The experience left me a simple reverence. Respecting old spaces also means accepting that some memories should not be tested. The house will keep breathing its ancient air, and I, outside, keep tending to my sleep. 10. The voice behind the door. In a remote cabin, I heard knocks at the door at dawn. 3. Blows, pauses, a tired calling. I opened a crack. Nothing but night. The voice, however, did not ask for distant help. It begged, "Let me in." I bolted the door with cold hands and retreated to the bedroom. The voice changed timbre and whispered from the other side of the bedroom door as if it were inside. It was as if the wood itself had gained an interlocutor. I waited until daylight, and when it came, a little light was enough to dispel the fear. But the shock made me pack and leave at the first hour. I learned that some knocks shouldn't be opened. After that night, the voice that had begged to be let in remained like a silent fracture in my nights. When I told the story, I felt many didn't believe, and some feared accepting that voices could be that close. Still, there is a clear lesson. Some solicitations are not requests for aid, but invitations to something that prefers to stay closed. Years later, I went back once to pick up something I'd forgotten, and the place was intact, calm, as if nothing had happened. I entered hesitantly and again felt that pressure in the air, the dense expectation. It seemed the place itself awaited confirmation that I had not given in. It breathed a silent sigh of relief. I locked the door on my way out, knowing the silence from then on would be only mine, without intruders. I spoke with people who study old sites and heard various explanations, audible resonances, accumulated memories, even psychological phenomena. Nothing, however, removed the sense that a voice can sometimes stand for more than a plea. It can be the culmination of expectations the wood keeps from those who once lived there. Understanding this gained me a respect for those knocks. Like someone who should not open certain drawers, I began to lock my doors more firmly and to avoid answering nighttime noises when I'm in cabins or borrowed houses. Caution ceased being just fear and became ritual, checking locks, having a planned escape, keeping lights on. Until dawn, these simple actions turned the night into something manageable. I still keep the memory of that voice as a warning. Not every knock asks for mercy. Sometimes a knock comes only to remind us that there are worlds approaching the door when we give in to the impulse to open without knowing what lies beyond. 11. The Candle Station. On a bend of the road at night I saw an old service station with candlelight flickering inside, a place that shouldn't exist on that map. I entered out of curiosity and found a woman behind the counter, motionless, her feet floating a few centimeters off the floor. Her silence was absolute. Her hands rested on the counter as though she waited in a different time. I tapped the door, and the bell's tinkle broke the quiet. The woman remained statue still, as if she were part of the building. I ran out, and as I ran, I heard nothing but my breath and the gravel crunch under my feet. I never returned. The sight of that floating woman haunted me more than how fast I ran away. Something in her inhuman balance lodged itself like a warning sign. After racing to the car, I knew I had crossed paths with something that did not define itself by human shape, and yet still sought a peculiar contact, like fixing its gaze in a window. The following night I stayed awake, wanting a rational explanation that never came. The mind tries to stitch narratives, an illness, a local festival, a strange performance. None held up against the precise repetition of details, the slight hovering, the lack of a proper reflection, the scene's perpetuity. I spoke to a man who'd worked the road his whole life. He offered only an admonition: don't go looking for what stares at you. The simplicity of that phrase felt like a manual for self-preservation. Over time, I checked old maps and local accounts, discovering the station had been a point of departures and disappearances in eras the memory chose to forget. Such a past, I found, tends to generate apparitions that are cartographies of absence, figures that remain when someone leaves and never comes back. Understanding that doesn't heal fear, but it frames it. There's a morbid pattern of repetition. When I travel secondary roads, a part of me is always wary. Any out-of-time structure could appear, with candles flickering even in the rain and shadows that don't obey physics. One learns to keep distance from facades lit by wax. What looks like an invitation is sometimes a trap for the curious. Today I avoid any station that leaves candlelight in its window, and when necessity forces me to stop, I keep the car running, doors locked. That suspended woman stayed with me as a reminder: not every face that appears is there to be understood. 12. The Lake Hotel. We had talked about exploring an abandoned hotel that, according to rumor, had been a place of parties until something turned it into silence. We found it at dusk: shattered windows, stones invading the lobby, and a lake behind it reflecting the night like an impenetrable mirror. In the ballroom, we saw shapes lined up by the windows, figure after figure that at first I took for mannequins. When they moved, the sensation froze us. They were bodies dressed in old garments, pale and stiff. Terror pushed us down the stairs and out to the car, and hurry was the only language we spoke during our escape. Since then, there are empty places that keep an audience. The sight of the figures in the ballroom left an impression that doesn't fit into rational words. The air felt denser, as if time and dust had merged into something that breathes. In the following days, I checked maps, asked old-timers, searched newspapers. The hotel came up often linked to stories of sudden departures and parties that ended in silence. I realized the mirror of that past reflects more than architecture. It reflects absences. When we tried to compare photos, looking at the blurred images of chandeliers and windows, a deeper discomfort set in. Some shadows seemed as accustomed to the light as the walls themselves. The idea that something could remain lying in wait turned the building into an organism with memory. That explains the sense of presence. There was not just inert matter there was remembrance. That night, driving away, I promised myself not to be curious again. Curiosity tends to bring us closer to answers we don't want to find. It's a thrill that costs dearly. Yet the hotel's silence was a lure to discovery, but also a lock for anyone trying to open it. I learned that some doors, however old, hide mechanisms that scent curious eyes. Over time, others told coincident stories. How the wind on the lake sounds different when someone passes near the hotel. How birds avoid the side that faces the building. Those coincidences form an unspoken consensus. The hotel and the lake have limits they choose to keep. We, through arrogance or need, sometimes cross them and later carry the weight of what we've seen. Today, for me, the hotel symbolizes a boundary. Not the kind you cross to gain something, but the kind you respect so you don't lose the rest of your humanity. I keep the sense that the world can endure ruins and old stories. Perhaps we cannot. 13. The echo that answers. Lost in a canyon, I heard my own voice repeat words with a disturbing precision. It wasn't merely a distant echo, it was as if something was imitating every syllable the instant after I spoke. When I asked, "Why does this happen?" the response was the same phrase spoken back, with an intonation that seemed to ask me as well. "Why do you run?" Footsteps came behind me, matching my pace. They sped up when I ran and stopped when I stopped. Reaching the clearing at the top was like surfacing from underwater. The air shifted, the fear eased, and the canyon returned to being only rock. But I never heard echoes the same way again. Now I always expect an answer where there should be no one to reply. I left the canyon breathing hard, but the episode left a mark that didn't fade with daylight. I realized echoes are not just sound repetitions. They are memories of what was said and carry residual intentions. On that hill, the voice that copied me was more than reverberation. It was a challenge. It asked why I ran, as if someone wanted me to stay and face something I preferred to avoid. Returning to the spot wasn't comfortable. When I went back, the walls resumed their echo roll, but less aggressively, more like a presence that waits. The experience taught me the difference between return and recycling of words. Some responses we receive in the world are merely versions of ourselves, repeated in a way that challenges our presence. What I heard was not a cold copy, it was an imitation with intent. Talking with a friend who studies acoustics, he told me that some places have unique timbres and that on rare occasions sound organizes itself to deceive the listener. That offered a technical consolation, but technical comfort rarely erases the emotional impression. The sense of being replicated still haunts me in tall building corridors where the echo can seem to moralize. Now, when I enter stone-clad spaces, I expect to hear back what I say, not out of fear, but out of prudence. The experience left me vigilant. Any perfect repetition of a sound can be a mirror, and mirrors, in the wrong places, tend to return a version of ourselves we don't recognize. I learned to avoid throwing loose phrases into cavernous spaces. I learned to speak less and listen more. Deep down, I learned that there are echoes that prefer to be company rather than mere return, and that sometimes the best answer is no answer at all. 14. At the lake at midnight. In a boat drifting under the moon, the vessel's radio exploded into static with overlapping voices and then went silent. A human call, distant, came from the lake. "Help!" The beam of my flashlight found no one, but the voice approached in layers, as if the water were returning words that didn't exist. When the static screamed an order, "Go away!" The urgency made us cut the motor and row to shelter by the shore. That night, something in the lake's dark mirror spoke with the haste of one who believes the world can be ripped from its place. We had been reminded we are not masters of that vastness. We left the lake feeling we had crossed a border where voices insist on remaining. That night in the boat stayed with me as a lesson about the limits of what we call company. The radio, bursting with mixed voices, left us unsettled, not just for a technical explanation, but for the sense that the lake had deciphered our presence and replied in its own language. When the voice ordered us to leave, it felt like direct counsel from something that knew more about the place than we did. The phenomenon gave us a new caution. The lake is not just water. It's a mirror of intentions. We came ashore feeling we had invaded a corner governed by its own rules. At dawn, there was no trace of the voice left, only the normal murmur of birds and the still surface that had returned to calm. Yet the urgency of the command, "Go away," echoed in the days that followed and remained a moral memory. Talking to locals, I found similar reports of calls arising with no apparent source. Boatmen who refused to row certain nights. Fishermen who changed sides without knowing why. Those accounts make up an atlas of every day. Fear. There are places where voices spring from the past and prefer not to be disturbed. For me, understanding that felt like learning etiquette. Respecting the lake is both prudence and reverence. Years later, when the wind cut across that same lake's surface, I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with gratitude. It's not always easy to accept that some things belong to other domains and only allow us an exterior view. Avoiding the place became an act of humility. Still, sometimes I catch myself staring at dark water and imagining the cadence of voices it might guard. I no longer go to those shores late. I traded spectacle for safety. Between curiosity and prudence, I chose the latter. And I think that may be one of the few sensible choices the night asks of us.